Welcome to this peaceful journey through time, where we'll explore one of history's most remarkable reigns as you drift into restful sleep. Tonight, we're traveling back to witness the extraordinary rise of Queen Victoria and the empire that would span a quarter of the globe. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful you're here with me on this soothing voyage through Victorian England. The year was 1819 and, in the grand halls of Kensington Palace, a future empress was taking her first breath. Victoria Alexandrina was born into a world where her destiny seemed anything but certain. The infant princess had no way of knowing that she would one day rule over territories so vast that the sun would never set upon them. Her childhood days were filled with the gentle rustle of silk dresses and the soft whisper of her governess reading lessons in the palace nursery. Picture young Victoria awakening each morning in her simply furnished bedroom, the pale London light filtering through tall windows as her German governess, Baroness Lyon, gently roused her for another day of careful education. The princess would rise at 7 sharp, her small hands reaching for the simple white dress laid out for her. There were no royal luxuries for this future queen. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, insisted on a Spartan upbringing that would build character rather than indulgence. Victoria's mornings began with a breakfast of plain bread and milk, eaten in silence, while her tutors prepared the day's lessons. She would sit at her small writing desk, her feet barely touching the floor, practicing her penmanship with careful strokes of the quill, the sound of her pen scratching against parchment mixed with the distant sounds of carriages rolling past the palace gates, carrying the business of a kingdom she did not yet know she would inherit. Her education was rigorous and methodical. History lessons transported her to ancient civilizations, while geography opened her mind to distant lands she could barely imagine. Little did she know that many of these far-off places would one day bow before her crown. The young princess would trace her finger along the coastlines of India and Australia, never dreaming that British ships would carry her authority to these distant shores. The afternoon hours found Victoria in the palace gardens, walking with measured steps along carefully manicured paths. Her mother maintained strict control over every aspect of her life, implementing what would later be known as the Kensington system. This rigid protocol meant that Victoria was never alone, never allowed to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand, and never permitted to meet people without careful supervision. The lonely princess found solace in her dolls, creating elaborate stories and conversations with these silent companions who became her closest friends. As evening approached, Victoria would sit in the drawing room while her mother entertained visitors. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the walls as conversations flowed around topics of politics and society. The young princess listened intently, absorbing discussions about the state of the kingdom, the struggles of the working classes, and the growing tensions across Europe. These conversations planted seeds of understanding that would later bloom into the wisdom of an empress during these early years. Victoria had no knowledge of her proximity to the throne. Her uncle, King William IV, ruled without direct heirs, but the line of succession seemed distant and uncertain. The princess went to sleep each night, unaware that fate was quietly arranging the pieces that would transform her from a sheltered child into the most powerful monarch on earth. The turning point came on a quiet morning in 1830, when Victoria was just 11 years old. Her governess approached, with unusual solemnity, carrying a family tree that would change everything. As the genealogical chart was spread before her, Victoria's eyes traced the lines of succession with growing realization. There, just a few steps from the crown, was her own name. The moment of discovery was profound, yet quiet. Dramatic music accompanied this revelation, only the gentle tick of the mantle clock and the whispered explanation of her destiny. From that day forward, Victoria's education took on new urgency and purpose. Her tutors began preparing her not just as a lady of noble birth, but as a future sovereign who would need to understand the complexities of governance. She studied constitutional law and parliamentary procedure, learning about the delicate balance between royal prerogative and democratic representation that defined the British system. The princess began each morning with lessons in statecraft, reading dispatches from various corners of the growing empire. Reports arrived from India, where British influence was expanding through the East India Company's commercial and military presence. Letters from Canada described the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast wilderness territories. Documents from Australia detailed the establishment of penal colonies that were slowly transforming into thriving settlements. Victoria's afternoons were devoted to understanding the economic forces that drove British expansion. She learned about the cotton mills of Manchester, where steam-powered machinery was revolutionizing textile production. The princess studied reports from Liverpool's bustling docks, where ships departed daily carrying British manufactured goods to distant markets and returned laden with raw materials from colonial territories. The concept of free trade fascinated the young princess as she grasped how British naval supremacy protected merchant vessels carrying goods across the world's oceans. Her tutors explained how the Royal Navy's dominance ensured that British commerce could flow freely, while competing nations struggled to protect their own trading routes. This maritime advantage was becoming the foundation upon which a global empire would be built. Evening lessons focused on the social challenges facing her future subjects. Victoria read about the growing industrial cities where factory workers labored in difficult conditions for long hours. She studied reports about child labor in coal mines and the emergence of reform movements calling for better working conditions. These early exposures to social issues would later influence her approach to governance and her support for various reform initiatives. The princess also learned about the complex relationships between different social classes in British society. The aristocracy maintained their traditional privileges, while a growing middle class of merchants and professionals was gaining economic power and political influence. Meanwhile, the working classes were beginning to organize and demand representation in government decisions that affected their daily lives. As Victoria approached her teenage years, her preparation for queenship intensified. She practiced receiving foreign dignitaries, learning the subtle protocols that govern diplomatic interactions. Mock ceremonies taught her the importance of royal symbolism and the careful choreography required for state occasions. Every gesture and expression would carry meaning. Once she ascended to the throne, the princess began studying the personalities and politics of European royal families, understanding how marriages and alliances could strengthen or weaken Britain's international position. She learned about the complex web of relationships that connected various monarchies and how these connections could be leveraged to advance British interests on the continental stage. Her education also encompassed the growing influence of public opinion in shaping government policy. The expansion of literacy and the growth of newspapers meant that political decisions were increasingly scrutinized by an informed citizenry. Victoria learned to understand how royal actions could influence public sentiment and how popular support could strengthen or undermine governmental authority. The mechanical innovations transforming British society captured Victoria's imagination as she learned about steam engines, railways, and telegraph systems that were shrinking distances and accelerating communication. These technologies were not merely curiosities, but tools that would enable more effective administration of a global empire. Messages that once took months to cross oceans could now be transmitted in weeks, while steamward ships could carry troops and supplies with unprecedented speed and reliability. By 1837, as Victoria approached her 18th birthday, the aging King William IV's health was clearly declining. The princess had transformed from a sheltered child into a young woman who understood the magnitude of the responsibilities awaiting her. Her daily routine now resembled that of a monarch in training, with formal audiences, policy briefings, and ceremonial duties filling her schedule. The final months before her accession were filled with intensive preparation for the transition of power. Victoria studied the precedents and procedures that would govern her coronation, learning about the ancient rituals that would transform her from princess to sovereign. She practiced the oaths she would take and rehearsed the responses she would give to the various ceremonies that would mar RK, her formal acceptance of royal authority. As spring turned to summer in 1837, everyone in the palace could sense that momentous changes were approaching. The young princess who had once played with dolls in the palace nursery was about to inherit an empire whose influence was spreading across continents and oceans. The quiet preparation of her youth was about to give way to the grand responsibilities of ruling the most powerful nation on earth. The morning of June 20th, 1837, dawned grey and misty over London. In her chamber at Kensington Palace, 18-year-old Victoria stirred beneath her simple cotton sheets, unaware that this would be her last day as a princess. The soft patter of rain against her windows mixed with the distant sounds of the city awakening. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets as they prepared for what they sensed would be a day unlike any other. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at the palace before dawn, their carriages clattering through the gates, while most of London still slept. They waited in the formal receiving room, their solemn faces reflecting the gravity of the news they carried. King William IV had passed away at Windsor Castle during the early hours, and with his death, the crown had passed to the young woman who still slumbered peacefully upstairs. When Victoria was finally awakened at 6, she descended the grand staircase in her dressing gown and slippers, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. The moment she entered the room and saw the assembled officials, she understood immediately. There was no need for elaborate explanations. The weight of destiny settled upon her small frame as she listened to the formal announcement of her uncle's death and her own accession to the throne. Her first act as queen was to request a moment. Tea alone. In the quiet of her private sitting room, Victoria knelt and prayed, asking for guidance in the enormous task that lay before her. When she emerged, she was no longer the sheltered princess who had been kept from independent thought and action. She was Queen Victoria, sovereign of the United Kingdom and ruler of territories that stretched from the foggy shores of Britain to the sun-baked plains of India. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. Victoria's first meeting with her Privy Council demonstrated a poise and authority that surprised even her most experienced advisors. She entered the council chamber with measured steps, her small stature somehow commanding the room filled with distinguished gentlemen who had served her predecessors. Her voice clear and steady carried across the chamber as she took the oath of allegiance and addressed her new government. The young queen's daily routine underwent a complete transformation. Her mornings now began at dawn with briefings from her private secretary, who would present the most pressing matters requiring royal attention. Dispatches from across the empire arrived daily, bringing news of challenges and opportunities from territories she had only read about in her geography lessons. Reports from India described the complex relationships between British officials and local rulers, while letters from Canada outlined the delicate balance required to govern French and English populations side by side. Victoria's breakfast table became a centre of governance where she would review documents while sipping her morning tea. Colonial governors sent detailed accounts of their territories, describing everything from trade statistics to local uprisings that required careful diplomatic handling. The Queen absorbed this information with remarkable attention to detail, asking probing questions that demonstrated her growing understanding of imperial administration. Her afternoons were devoted to audiences with ministers and ambassadors, each meeting requiring her to shift between different aspects of her vast responsibilities. She might discuss naval deployments in the Mediterranean with the First Lord of the Admiral Tay, then immediately turned to questions of Indian policy with representatives from the East India Company. The seamless transitions between these complex topics revealed Victoria's natural aptitude for the multifaceted nature of imperial governance. The Queen's evening hours were spent in correspondence, her pen scratching across parchment as she wrote letters to colonial officials, European monarchs, and parliamentary leaders. She maintained detailed journals recording her thoughts on the various challenges facing her empire and developing her own perspectives on the best approaches to governance. These private writings revealed a monarch who was not content to simply approve the decisions of others, but who sought to understand and influence the forces shaping her realm. Within months of her accession, Victoria began asserting her authority in ways that surprised the political establishment. She insisted on reading all important documents personally, rather than relying solely on ministerial summaries. Her questions during cabinet meetings demonstrated a grasp of policy details that exceeded what many had expected from someone so young and seemingly inexperienced. The Queen's approach to imperial expansion reflected both pragmatic calculation and genuine concern for her subjects' welfare. When reports arrived describing conflicts in Afghanistan, she demanded detailed explanations of British strategic interests, while also inquiring about the impact on local populations. Her correspondence with military commanders emphasized the importance of minimizing civilian casualties, respecting local customs wherever possible. Victoria's fascination with the technological innovations transforming her empire led to regular meetings with engineers and inventors. She studied plans for railway construction across India, understanding how these iron roads would bind distant territories more closely to British administration. The Queen grasped how steam-powered communication could transform imperial governance, allowing her government to respond to distant crises with unprecedented speed. Her interest in social reform grew stronger as she received reports about working conditions in British factories and mines. Victoria read testimonies from parliamentary commissions investigating child labour, and her private letters revealed genuine distress about the hardships faced by her industrial subjects. She began supporting reform initiatives that would improve working conditions while maintaining the economic growth that funded imperial expansion. The Queen's daily routine included regular consultations with military advisors who briefed her on the strategic challenges of defending such a vast empire. She studied maps showing British naval bases and troop deployments, understanding how the Royal Navy's dominance enabled Britain to project power across the world's oceans. Victoria grasped the delicate balance required to maintain security while avoiding the enormous costs that could bankrupt the treasury. Her evenings often featured discussions with scholars and explorers who brought first-hand accounts of distant territories. Victoria listened intently to descriptions of African landscapes, Australian wilderness, and Indian cities, building a mental picture of the diverse populations and environments under her rule. These conversations informed her understanding of the cultural sensitivities required for effective imperial administration. The Queen's approach to diplomatic relations reflected her growing confidence in Britain's global position. She received foreign ambassadors with careful attention to protocol, understanding how these ceremonial interactions could influence international relationships. Victoria's correspondence with European monarchs combined personal warmth with subtle assertions of British interests, demonstrating her skill at blending friendship with statecraft. As 1838 progressed, Victoria's transformation from sheltered princess to confident monarch became increasingly evident to those around her. She had developed her own perspectives on imperial policy, often challenging ministerial recommendations with well-informed alternatives. The Queen's daily schedule expanded to accommodate the growing demands of governing an empire where the sun never set. Yet, she maintained remarkable energy and attention to detail in all her duties. Her personal study became a command center for imperial administration, filled with maps, reports, and correspondence from every corner of her dominions. Victoria would spend hours reviewing these materials, developing her understanding of how local conditions in distant territories affected broader imperial interests. She began formulating her own vision of how the British Empire should develop, combining expansion with responsible governance. The young queen's evenings were increasingly devoted to planning for the future of her empire. She studied demographic reports showing population growth in various colonies, understanding how these trends would affect economic development and political stability. Victoria grasped the importance of education and infrastructure in building loyalty among colonial populations, supporting initiatives that would improve living conditions while strengthening imperial bonds. Her correspondence with colonial officials revealed a monarch who was deeply engaged with the practical challenges of imperial administration. Victoria asked detailed questions about tax collection, judicial systems, and military recruitment, demonstrating her commitment to understanding every aspect of governance. She insisted on regular reports that would keep her informed about conditions throughout her empire, refusing to remain distant from the realities facing her subjects. As her first year as queen drew to a close, Victoria had established herself as a hands-on monarch who intended to play an active role in shaping her empire's destiny. The quiet princess, who had once traced coastlines on classroom maps, was now directing the policies that would determine how British influence spread across those same territories. Her daily routine reflected the complexity of governing a global empire while maintaining the delicate balance between authority and responsibility that defined constitutional monarchy. The transformation was complete, yet it was only the beginning. Queen Victoria had proven her capability to assume the throne, but the true test of her reign lay ahead as the British Empire entered a period of unprecedented expansion and influence that would reshape the entire world. The coronation of Queen Victoria on June 28, 1838, marked not merely the crowning of a young monarch, but the symbolic birth of an empire that would come to dominate the globe. As dawn broke over Westminster Abbey that summer morning, the ancient stones seemed to whisper of the momentous transformation about to unfold. The 18-year-old queen had spent the night in restless preparation, her mind racing through the ceremonies that would formally invest her with powers beyond anything her predecessors had ever wielded. Victoria rose before the sun, her ladies in waiting, moving silently around her chambers as they prepared the elaborate coronation robes. St. Edward's crown waited in the Tower of London, its ancient gold and precious stones, soon to rest upon the head of a sovereign whose dominion would stretch across continents. The young queen stood before her mirror, watching, as layers of silk and hermine transformed her from a nervous young woman into the living embodiment of imperial majesty. The procession through London's streets revealed the genuine affection her subjects already felt for their new sovereign. Thousands lined the route from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, their cheers echoing off the buildings as Victoria's golden state coach rolled slowly through the city. The Queen sat, rigidly upright, her small hands folded carefully in her lap, acknowledging the crowds with subtle nods that conveyed both dignity and warmth. Inside Westminster Abbey, nearly 8,000 guests filled every available space, their silk gowns and military uniforms, creating a tapestry of colour beneath the soaring Gothic arches. Victoria walked down the aisle with measured steps, her train held by 8 daughters of dukes and ears, each step carrying her closer to a destiny that would reshape the world. The ancient ceremony proceeded with careful precision, each ritual connecting her to centuries of royal tradition while preparing her for challenges no previous monarch had faced. When the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the crown upon Victoria's head, the weight was both literal and symbolic. The young queen felt the physical pressure of the ancient circlet, but also sensed the immense responsibilities now resting upon her shoulders. In that moment, she became not just Queen of the United Kingdom, but sovereign of territories whose full extent was still being discovered by explorers and adventurers, pushing the boundaries of the known world. The months following her coronation saw Victoria settling into the rhythms of imperial governance with remarkable efficiency. Her mornings began in the Blue Room at Buckingham Palace, where her private secretary would present the most urgent correspondence from across her dominions. Letters arrived from governors-general in Canada and Australia, describing the challenges of administering territories larger than all of Europe combined. Reports from India detailed the complex relationships between British officials and the hundreds of princely states that maintained nominal independence while accepting British oversight. Victoria's breakfast conversations with her ministers revealed her growing grasp of imperial strategy. She understood that British power rested not merely on military might, but on the intricate web of commercial relationships that connected London to markets across the globe. The Queen studied trade statistics with the same attention she once devoted to her childhood lessons, recognizing that cotton from America, tea from China, and spices from India formed the economic foundation of her empire's strength. Her daily routine included regular consultations with the First Lord of the Admiral, who would spread naval charts across her desk to illustrate Britain's growing maritime dominance. Victoria traced the routes of Royal Navy squadrons patrolling distant waters, understanding how these ships protected British merchants while projecting imperial power to potential rivals. She grasped the strategic importance of coaling stations and naval bases that allowed British vessels to operate effectively in every ocean. The Queen's afternoons were devoted to audiences with returning colonial officials who brought first-hand accounts of life in distant territories. She listened intently to descriptions of Canadian lumber camps, Australian sheep stations, and Indian tea plantations, building a comprehensive understanding of how British influence was transforming local economies and societies. These conversations informed her approach to policy decisions that would affect millions of subjects she would never meet, but whose welfare she considered her personal responsibility. Victoria's evening hours were spent in her private study, surrounded by maps and documents that illustrated the growing complexity of imperial administration. She maintained detailed correspondence with colonial governors, offering guidance on local challenges while ensuring that distant territories remained aligned with broader imperial objectives. Her letters revealed a monarch who understood that effective governance required balancing central authority with local autonomy, allowing colonial officials sufficient flexibility to address unique regional circumstances. The Queen's approach to expansion reflected careful calculation rather than reckless ambition. When opportunities arose to extend British influence into new territories, Victoria insisted on thorough analysis of potential costs and benefits. Supported expansion that would enhance British security or economic interests, but opposed adventures that might drain imperial resources without providing substantial advantages. Her ministers learned to present colonial proposals with detailed justifications that addressed both strategic and financial considerations. Victoria's daily schedule increasingly reflected the global nature of her responsibilities. She might begin her morning reviewing reports from Hong Kong about tensions with Chinese authorities, then shift to discussions about railway construction in India, followed by consultations about territorial disputes in Africa. The seamless transitions between these diverse topics demonstrated her remarkable ability to master complex information while maintaining focus on overarching imperial objectives. Her personal interest in technology, innovation, led to regular meetings with engineers and inventors whose creations were transforming imperial communication and transportation. Victoria studied plans for telegraph cables that would connect London to distant territories in minutes rather than months. Understanding how rapid communication would revolutionize colonial administration, she supported railway projects that would bind scattered territories together while opening new regions to British commercial penetration. The Queen's concern for her subjects' welfare extended throughout her empire, leading to support for educational and medical initiatives in colonial territories. She funded schools and hospitals in India and Africa, recognizing that improving local conditions would strengthen imperial bonds while fulfilling her moral obligations as sovereign. Victoria's correspondence with missionaries and educators revealed genuine interest in the welfare of populations whose languages and customs differed dramatically from her own experience. Her evening meetings with military commanders focused on the strategic challenges of defending such vast territories with limited resources. Victoria studied deployment patterns that maximized British military effectiveness while minimizing costs. Understanding that imperial expansion required careful balance between ambition and available means, she supported military reforms that would improve efficiency while maintaining the professional standards that made British forces effective in diverse environments. The Queen's daily routine included regular reviews of intelligence, reports from across her empire, keeping her informed about potential threats to British interests. She learned to identify patterns in seemingly unrelated events, understanding how local disturbances in one territory might affect stability elsewhere. Victoria's grasp of imperial interconnectio NS enabled her to anticipate challenges and coordinate responses that address root causes, rather than merely symptoms. Her approach to diplomatic relations reflected Britain's growing global influence. As Victoria received ambassadors from nations seeking British support or attempting to limit British expansion, she conducted these meetings with careful attention to protocol, while subtly asserting British interests, understanding that diplomatic success often determined whether expansion would proceed peacefully or require costly military intervention. The Queen's correspondence with foreign monarchs combined personal relationships with strategic calculations that advanced imperial objectives. As 1839 unfolded, Victoria's mastery of imperial governance became increasingly evident to those around her. She had developed comprehensive understanding of how distant territories contributed to British wealth and security, while also grasping the responsibilities that empire imposed upon her government. The Queen's daily decisions affected populations from the Arctic to the tropics, requiring her to balance competing interests while maintaining the delicate equilibrium that sustained British dominance. Her personal study had become the nerve center of global empire, where information from every continent converged for royal consideration. Victoria spent her evenings analyzing reports that revealed both opportunities and challenges facing British interests worldwide. She began formulating long-term strategies that would guide imperial development for decades to come, understanding that her decisions would determine whether the British Empire would continue expanding or begin the slow process of decline that had claimed previous empires throughout history. The transformation from sheltered princess to imperial sovereign was now complete, but Victoria understood that her greatest challenges lay ahead. The British Empire stood at the threshold of unprecedented expansion, with opportunities emerging in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific that would test every aspect of imperial capability. The young queen, who'd once memorized geography lessons, was now directing the policies that would determine how those distant lands would be incorporated into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The early months of 1840 brought whispers of romance to the corridors of Buckingham Palace, as courtiers noticed the young queen's particular interest in her German cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Victoria would spend her mornings reviewing correspondence with unusual attention. Whenever letters bearing the Coburg seal arrived among her official dispatches, her ladies-in-waiting observed how she would set aside matters of state to read these personal messages, a soft smile crossing her face as she absorbed news from the principality where her future consort was completing his education. Prince Albert arrived in London on a crisp October morning, his carriage wheels echoing across the palace courtyard as Victoria watched from her window above. She had spent the early hours in careful preparation, her dressers arranging her hair with particular attention while selecting a gown of deep blue silk that complemented her dark eyes. The Queen understood that this meeting would determine not merely her personal happiness, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. A royal marriage was never simply a matter of affection, but a strategic alliance that could strengthen or weaken the empire's position in European politics. Their first private audience took place in the White Drawing Room, where afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows to illuminate the young couple's conversation. Victoria found herself captivated by Albert Serre, whose demeanor and his thoughtful observations about art, music, and literature. Here was a companion who could match her intellectual curiosity while bringing perspectives shaped by continental European experience. Their discussions ranged from philosophy to politics, each exchange revealing shared interests that transcended the formal requirements of royal courtship. Within days of Albert's arrival, Victoria had reached her decision. The Queen summoned him to her private study on October 15th, where she would break with centuries of tradition by proposing marriage herself. Constitutional law required that she, as sovereign, must be the one to make the offer rather than accept a proposal from her suitor. The moment was both intimate and historic as Victoria spoke the words that would transform not only her personal life but the very nature of royal partnership in governing an expanding empire. Their wedding on February 10, 1841, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, established new traditions that would influence royal ceremonies for generations. Victoria chose to wear white silk satin rather than the traditional silver and gold, creating a fashion that would spread throughout her empire as brides everywhere adopted the royal example. Prince Albert stood beside her in the uniform of a British field marshal, symbolizing his new role as consort to the sovereign of territories spanning every continent. The marriage immediately transformed the daily rhythms of palace life, as Albert brought Germanic efficiency and methodical organization to the somewhat chaotic atmosphere that had characterized Victoria's early reign. The prince consort established regular schedules for meals, audiences, and correspondence that maximized the Queen's effectiveness, while ensuring adequate time for the personal relationship that anchored their partnership. Their breakfast, conversations, came in formal cabinet meetings where Victoria could test ideas with someone who understood both her personal nature and her public responsibilities. Albert's influence on imperial policy became apparent within months of their marriage, as his systematic approach to problem-solving complemented Victoria's intuitive grasp of political relationships. The prince consort would spend his mornings reviewing colonial reports with the same methodical attention he had once devoted to his university studies, preparing detailed analyses that helped the Queen understand complex situations in distant territories. His continental perspective proved valuable in assessing European reactions to British expansion, enabling more sophisticated diplomatic strategies. The royal couple's daily routine included joint audiences with colonial officials, where Albert's probing questions often revealed aspects of imperial administration that might otherwise have escaped attention. He possessed a gift for identifying connections between seemingly unrelated problems, helping Victoria understand how challenges in one territory might affect stability throughout her empire. Their evening discussions became strategic planning sessions, where they would analyze intelligence reports and correspondence from governors general across their dominions. Victoria's pregnancy in late 1840 added new dimensions to imperial governance, as the Queen had to balance her expanding family responsibilities with the demands of ruling territories where rebellions, natural disasters, and diplomatic crises required immediate attention. She continued her morning routine of reviewing dispatches from across the empire, though now she might pause to rest her hand on her growing abdomen while contemplating how her decisions would affect the world her children would inherit. The birth of Princess Victoria Adelaide, Mary Louise on November 21st, 1840, marked the beginning of a royal dynasty that would shape imperial development for the remainder of the century. The Queen held her newborn daughter while reviewing reports from India, understanding that this child might one day inherit an empire even larger than the one currently under her rule. The infant princess slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her cradle songs were accompanied by discussions of territorial expansion and colonial administration. Albert's role as prince consort evolved rapidly as he assumed increasing responsibilities for managing the administrative aspects of imperial governance. His mornings were spent in detailed correspondence with colonial officials, providing them with guidance that reflected both his own analytical capabilities and his intimate understanding of the Queen's preferences and priorities. The prince consort became an extension of royal authority, enabling Victoria to maintain personal oversight of imperial affairs, while also attending to her growing family responsibilities. The royal nursery at Buckingham Palace became an unlikely centre of imperial planning, as Victoria would often conduct business while nursing her children or supervising their early education. She understood that these future princes and princesses would need comprehensive understanding of the empire they might one day help govern, leading her to ensure that even their childhood games included references to distant territories and diverse populations under British rule. Victoria's daily schedule expanded to accommodate the complex demands of motherhood and imperial sovereignty, requiring careful coordination between personal and public responsibilities. She might spend her morning reviewing military dispatches from Afghanistan while her infant daughter played at her feet, then shift to consultations with the Governor-General of Canada while directing the children's afternoon lessons. The seamless integration of family life and imperial governance created new models for royal behavior that would influence monarchical traditions throughout Europe. The Queen's approach to expansion during this period reflected both increased confidence and growing caution, as she recognized that imperial adventures could affect not only her subjects, but her own children's future security. Victoria supported territorial acquisitions that would strengthen British strategic positions while providing her descendants with secure foundations for continued leadership. Her correspondence with colonial governors emphasized the importance of establishing stable institutions that could maintain British influence across generations. Albert's systematic approach to imperial intelligence gathering created new efficiencies in colonial administration, as the prince consort established regular reporting schedules that ensured comprehensive information flow from distant territories. His morning routine included detailed analysis of these reports, identifying patterns and trends that might escape notice in the daily rush of crisis management. The prince consort summaries became essential reading for cabinet ministers responsible for colonial affairs. The royal couple's evening hours were devoted to long-term strategic planning, as they recognized that the empire's continued expansion required careful consideration of geographic, economic, and political factors that would determine future success or failure. Victoria and Albert would spread maps across their private study floor, tracing potential railway routes through India or discussing the strategic implications of territorial acquisitions in Africa. These intimate planning sessions shaped policies that would affect millions of people across multiple continents. Their joint approach to imperial governance created unprecedented coordination between royal authority and administrative efficiency. As Albert's methodical preparation enabled Victoria to make informed decisions with remarkable speed and accuracy, colonial officials learned to expect rapid responses to their requests, as the royal partnership could process complex information and formulate comprehensive policies faster than traditional governmental procedures had allowed. The Queen's growing family provided new perspectives on imperial responsibilities as Victoria began considering how territorial expansion and colonial development would affect the world her children would inherit. She supported educational initiatives throughout the empire, understanding that stable colonial societies would provide better foundations for her descendants' future leadership. The royal nursery's lessons increasingly included geography and languages that would prepare the young princes and princesses for their roles in governing diverse populations. Victoria's daily correspondence expanded to include personal letters to colonial officials, wives, creating informal networks of communication that supplemented official, governmental channels. These relationships provided insights into social conditions throughout the empire, helping the Queen understand how British rule affected families and communities in distant territories. Her evening hours often included responses to these personal letters, maintaining connections that humanized imperial relationships. As 1842 approached, the royal couple had established new paradigms for imperial governance that combined personal partnership with systematic administration. Their daily routines reflected the global nature of British responsibilities while maintaining the intimate family relationships that anchored their authority. Victoria and Albert had transformed the monarchy into an efficient instrument of imperial expansion, creating foundations for territorial acquisitions and administrative reforms that would characterize the remainder of the 19th century. The empire stood poised for unprecedented growth, with opportunities emerging in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific that would test every aspect of the administrative systems the royal couple had developed. Victoria's morning reviews of colonial correspondence revealed both the challenges and possibilities that lay ahead as British influence continued spreading across territories whose full potential remained to be discovered and developed. The dawn of 1842 found Queen Victoria in her private chambers, cradling her second child, Prince Albert Edward, while simultaneously reviewing dispatches that would reshape the map of Asia. The infant prince, future King Edward II, slept peacefully against his mother's shoulder as she read reports from the First Opium War the Bra had concluded just months earlier. The Treaty of Nanking lay spread across her writing desk, its terms penning Chinese ports to British commerce and ceding Hong Kong to the Crown in perpetuity. Victoria's morning routine now included feeding her children while absorbing intelligence from the Far East, where British merchants were establishing trading posts along the Chinese coast. She would gently rock Prince Albert Edward while studying maps that showed the new territories acquired through diplomatic negotiation and military pressure. The Queen understood that these distant acquisitions represented more than commercial opportunities. They're stepping stones for British influence across the Pacific Ocean. Her breakfast conversations with Prince Albert increasingly focused on the strategic implications of territorial expansion in multiple directions. Simultaneously, while one hand held her teacup, the other wall traced shipping routes on charts, showing how goods from India could now flow through Hong Kong to reach markets throughout Asia. The Prince Consort would present carefully analyzed reports about population centers, natural resources, and local political structures in newly acquired territories. The royal couple's daily walks through the palace gardens became mobile strategy sessions as they discussed the challenges of administering territories whose cultures and languages differed dramatically from anything in their previous experience. Victoria would pause beside rose bushes to consider how British legal systems might be adapted to local customs, while Albert calculated the costs of establishing governmental infrastructure in regions that lacked European-style administrative traditions. Their afternoon audiences with returning colonial officials brought vivid descriptions of life in territories that existed only as names on maps to most British citizens. Victoria listened intently as merchants described the bustling streets of Bombay, where British and Indian traders negotiated deals that enriched both communities. Military officers provided detailed accounts of frontier regions where British authority was still being established through careful diplomacy, backed by the implicit threat of superior firepower. The Queen's evening correspondence expanded to include letters from governors and administrators throughout Asia, each message requiring careful consideration of how local decisions might affect broader imperial interests. She would sit in her private study with Prince Albert Edward, sleeping in a cradle beside her desk, reviewing reports that described everything from tax collection procedures to educational initiatives designed to create loyalty among diverse populations. Victoria's approach to expansion during this period reflected growing sophistication about the complexities of governing culturally diverse territories across vast distances. Her morning briefings included detailed discussions about religious sensitivities, traditional authority structures, and economic systems that required careful integration with British administrative practices. The Queen insisted on regular reports about local reactions to British rule, understanding that sustainable expansion required acceptance rather than mere submission. The royal nursery became an unlikely centre of imperial intelligence, as Victoria would often conduct important meetings while supervising her children's early education. Foreign ambassadors learned to expect informal audiences where diplomatic negotiations might be interrupted by the needs of nursing infants or the questions of curious toddlers. These domestic settings paradoxically enhance the Queen's authority, demonstrating her ability to balance multiple complex responsibilities simultaneously. Prince Albert's systematic approach to colonial administration created new efficiencies in managing information flows from territories spanning multiple time zones. His morning routine included careful review of overnight telegrams from India, afternoon dispatches from Australia, and evening reports from Canadian territories. The Prince Consort developed innovative filing systems that enabled rapid access to relevant information when crises required immediate royal attention. The Queen's daily schedule reflected the accelerating pace of imperial expansion, as opportunities emerged faster than traditional governmental procedures could process them. Victoria learned to make crucial decisions about territorial acquisitions and administrative appointments, while managing the practical demands of raising young children who would eventually inherit the consequences of her choices. Her ability to shift seamlessly between maternal duties and imperial strategy impressed even experienced ministers who struggled to match her mental agility. Their joint approach to expansion emphasized careful preparation and systematic implementation rather than impulsive territorial acquisition. Victoria and Albert would spend their evenings analyzing detailed reports about potential new territories, considering not only immediate strategic benefits but also long-term implications for imperial stability and development. They understood that hasty expansion could create administrative burdens that might ultimately weaken rather than strengthen British power. The royal couple's breakfast discussions increasingly focused on the technological innovations that were transforming imperial communication and transportation. Steam-powered ships could now carry messages and supplies between London and distant territories in weeks rather than months, while telegraph lines were beginning to connect major colonial centres to enable rapid coordination of policy decisions. Victoria grasped how these innovations would revolutionize imperial governance by enabling more direct oversight of distant administrators. Her morning routine included careful study of engineering reports describing railway construction projects that would bind scattered territories together, while opening new regions to British commercial penetration. The Queen traced proposed rail routes across maps of India, understanding how these iron roads would transform both military strategy and economic development throughout the subcontinent. She supported infrastructure investments that would strengthen imperial bonds while generating revenue to fund further expansion. Victoria's afternoon audiences with merchants and explorers brought first-hand accounts of territories that remained largely unknown to European geographers. She listened to descriptions of African kingdoms, South American republics, and Pacific islands, where British influence was beginning to penetrate through commercial relationships and diplomatic initiatives. These conversations informed her understanding of how expansion might proceed in regions that lacked established governmental structures. The Queen's evening correspondence included personal letters to colonial officials' families, creating informal networks of communication that supplemented official governmental channels. These relationships provided insights into social conditions throughout the empire, helping Victoria understand how British rule affected daily life in distant communities. Her responses demonstrated genuine concern for the welfare of subjects she would never meet, but whose loyalty she considered essential for imperial stability. Prince Albert's role as royal consort evolved to include direct oversight of colonial intelligence operations, as his analytical skills proved valuable for identifying patterns in seemingly unrelated events across different territories. The prince consort would spend his mornings correlating reports from various sources, looking for connections that might indicate emerging threats or opportunities requiring royal attention. His summaries became essential reading for ministers responsible for imperial policy. The royal couple's daily routine included joint review of military deployment patterns, as they recognized that effective defense of such vast territories required strategic positioning of limited forces to maximum advantage. Victoria would study troop disposition charts while nursing her children, understanding that military decisions made in London could determine the success or failure of British authority in regions thousands of miles away. Their approach to diplomatic relations reflected Britain's growing global influence. As Victoria received ambassadors from nations seeking British support or attempting to limit British expansion, she conducted these meetings with careful attention to protocol while subtly asserting British interests, understanding that diplomatic success often determined whether expansion would proceed peacefully or require costly military intervention. The Queen's correspondence with foreign monarchs combined personal relationships with strategic calculations that advanced imperial objectives. As 1843 unfolded, Victoria's mastery of imperial governance enabled her to manage expanding responsibilities while maintaining the personal relationships that anchored royal authority. Her daily decisions affected populations from the Arctic to the equator, requiring careful balance between competing interests, while preserving the delicate equilibrium that sustained British dominance. The Queen had transformed from a young mother learning to govern into a confident sovereign, directing the expansion of history's largest empire. Her private study had evolved into a command center, where information from every continent converged for royal analysis, while the royal nursery provided constant reminder that imperial decisions would determine the world her children would inherit. Victoria spent her evenings formulating policies that would guide British expansion for decades to come, understanding that her choices would establish precedents affecting generations of subjects throughout her growing empire. The morning routine that began with feeding her infants had expanded to include briefings about territorial acquisitions, trade, negotiations, and military campaigns that were extending British influence into regions that had never experienced European authority. Victoria's ability to process complex information while managing family responsibilities demonstrated the remarkable adaptability that would characterize her long reign as sovereign of the greatest empire in human history. The young queen, who had once studied geography lessons, was now directing the policies that would determine how those distant lands would be governed, developed, and integrated into a global system of British authority that was reshaping civilization itself across multiple continents and countless diverse populations. The gentle chimes of the palace clock tower marked the passing hours as Victoria's empire continued its relentless expansion across the globe. Each morning brought fresh dispatches from territories that seemed to multiply with each passing season, their names becoming familiar through constant repetition in royal correspondence. The Queen would rise at dawn to find her breakfast table laden not just with porridge and tea, but with reports from governors who administered populations larger than most European nations. In the spring of 1843, Victoria's morning ritual included nursing her youngest child while reviewing telegrams from Kolkata, where British administrators were implementing new taxation systems across the Bengal Presidency. The infant prince would gurgle contentedly against her shoulder as she absorbed details about railway construction projects that would connect the great cities of India through ribbons of steel and steam. These iron pathways represented more than mere transportation. They were the arteries through which British authority would pump life into the furthest reaches of the subcontinent. Her private secretary would enter the Blue Room precisely at 8 his arms laden with leather portfolios containing the overnight correspondence from across the empire. Victoria would listen intently as he summarized the most pressing matters, from border disputes in Burma to trade negotiations in Singapore. The Queen had developed a remarkable ability to shift her attention seamlessly between maternal duties and imperial strategy, often signing territorial annexation orders while simultaneously directing her children's morning lessons. The royal breakfast had evolved into an informal cabinet meeting where Prince Albert would present his careful analysis of colonial reports while Victoria fed her growing family. Their conversations ranged across continents as they discussed the challenges of governing territories whose combined population now exceeded that of Europe itself. The Prince Consort's methodical approach complemented the Queen's intuitive understanding of political relationships, creating a partnership that could process vast amounts of information with unprecedented efficiency. Victoria's immediate morning routine included audiences with returning colonial officials who brought first-hand accounts of life in territories that existed as mere dots on the maps covering her study walls. She would receive these visitors in the white drawing room, where afternoon sunlight illuminated their weather-beaten faces as they described the realities of administering justice in regions where British law was still taking root among ancient customs and traditions. These meetings provided texture to the dry statistics that filled official reports as veteran administrators shared stories of local ceremonies where British flags were raised alongside traditional banners, in ceremonies that blended imperial authority with indigenous celebration. Victoria absorbed these accounts with genuine fascination, understanding that successful expansion required adaptation rather than mere imposition of British practices upon unwilling populations. Her correspondence during this period revealed growing sophistication in her approach to imperial governance, as letters to colonial governors emphasized the importance of respecting local sensitivities while maintaining the essential elements of British authority. The Queen insisted on regular reports about educational initiatives designed to create literate populations who could participate effectively in the expanding commercial networks that connected distant territories to London markets. The afternoon hours found Victoria in her private study, surrounded by maps that illustrated the growing complexity of imperial administration. She would trace shipping routes with her finger while her children played quietly on the Persian carpets, their innocent games often incorporating the exotic names of territories their mother governed. The royal nursery had become inadvertently educational as toy soldiers represented garrisons stationed from Gibraltar to Hong Kong, while picture books depicted landscapes from Canadian forests to Australian plains. Prince Albert's influence on colonial policy became increasingly evident as his systematic approach to problem solving transformed the chaotic information flows that had characterized earlier imperial administration. The Prince Consort established regular reporting schedules that ensured comprehensive coverage of developments throughout the empire, while his analytical summaries enabled Victoria to identify patterns that might otherwise escape notice. In the daily rush of crisis management, their evening discussions had evolved into strategic planning sessions where they would analyze intelligence reports while the children slept peacefully in the nursery above. Victoria and Albert would spread charts across the study floor, examining potential trade routes through regions that remained largely unmapped by European explorers. These intimate conversations shaped policies that would affect millions of people across multiple continents. As the royal couple balanced immediate practical concerns with long-term strategic objectives, the Queen's daily routine reflected the accelerating pace of territorial acquisition as opportunities emerged, faster than traditional governmental procedures could accommodate them. Steam-powered communication was beginning to compress the vast distances that separated London from distant territories, enabling more direct oversight of colonial administrators, while creating expectations for rapid responses to local challenges and Opportunities. Victoria's morning briefings increasingly included reports from territories whose names had been unknown to European geographers just years earlier. The systematic exploration of Africa was revealing kingdoms and resources that offered new possibilities for British expansion, while diplomatic initiatives in the Pacific were establishing relationships with island communities that could provide strategic bases for naval operations across the world's largest ocean. Her approach to expansion during this period emphasized careful preparation and gradual implementation rather than dramatic territorial seizures that might provoke international opposition. Victoria supported initiatives that would establish British influence through commercial relationships and diplomatic agreements. Understanding that sustainable expansion required local acceptance rather than mere military occupation, the royal couple's joint oversight of imperial intelligence operations created unprecedented coordination between different aspects of colonial administration, as Albert's methodical analysis enabled Victoria to understand connections between seemingly unrelated developments in distant territories. Their breakfast conversations might begin with reports from Canadian lumber camps and shift seamlessly to discussions of tea plantation management in Ceylon, as they grasped how economic relationships in one region affected stability throughout their growing empire. Victoria's correspondence expanded to include personal letters to colonial officials' wives, creating informal networks of communication that provided insights into social conditions beyond the scope of official governmental reports. These relationships humanized imperial administration by connecting the Queen directly with families who were implementing British authority in communities that maintained their own cultural traditions and social structures. The Queen's afternoon audiences with merchants and explorers brought vivid descriptions of territories that remained frontier regions where British influence was still being established through patient negotiation with local leaders. She listened intently to accounts of diplomatic ceremonies where traditional rulers accepted British protection in exchange for commercial privileges, understanding that these agreements created foundations for gradual expansion of imperial authority. Her evening hours were devoted to correspondence with military commanders who provided detailed assessments of the strategic challenges involved in defending such vast territories with limited resources. Victoria studied deployment patterns that maximize British military effectiveness while minimizing costs, recognizing that imperial expansion required careful balance between ambition and available means. The royal nursery provided constant reminder that imperial decisions would determine the world her children would inherit, leading Victoria to support educational and infrastructure initiatives that would create stable foundations for continued British leadership. Her letters to colonial governors emphasized the importance of establishing institutions that could maintain imperial unity across generations, while also accommodating the legitimate aspirations of diverse populations seeking opportunities for advancement within British systems. Prince Albert's systematic approach to colonial administration enabled more effective coordination between different governmental departments responsible for imperial affairs, as his analytical capabilities helped identify potential conflicts between competing policies before they could create serious problems. The Prince Consort's morning routine included a detailed review of inter-departmental correspondence, ensuring that decisions made in one ministry would not inadvertently undermine initiatives being pursued by another. Victoria's daily schedule had expanded to accommodate the complex demands of governing territories, where local conditions varied dramatically from Arctic wilderness to tropical plantations. She might spend her morning reviewing reports about copper mining operations in Canada, then shift to discussions of cotton cultivation in Egypt, followed by consultations about diplomatic relations with Chinese authorities who were adapting to expanded British commercial presence. Their joint approach to imperial governance created new models for royal authority that combined traditional monarchical prerogatives with systematic administrative efficiency. Colonial officials learned to expect comprehensive guidance that reflected both the Queen's political instincts and The prince consort's analytical preparation, enabling more consistent implementation of imperial policies across diverse territorial environments. The queen's growing confidence in imperial matters enabled her to challenge ministerial recommendations when her own analysis suggested alternative approaches might prove more effective. Victoria's correspondence with cabinet members revealed a sovereign who understood the complexities of colonial administration well enough to offer substantive critiques of proposed policies. While her suggestions often proved superior to the original proposals as 1844 approached, the royal couple had established administrative systems that could accommodate continued territorial expansion while maintaining the personal oversight that ensured imperial policies reflected royal priorities. Victoria's morning routine of reviewing colonial correspondence while managing family responsibilities had become a model for balancing multiple complex duties. While Albert's systematic analysis provided the intellectual framework that transformed scattered information into coherent imperial strategy, the empire stood poised for another phase of unprecedented growth, with opportunities emerging in regions that would test every aspect of the governmental systems the royal couple had developed. Victoria's daily decisions continued to affect populations across every inhabited continent as British influence spread through networks of commerce, diplomacy, and gradual territorial acquisition that were reshaping the global balance of power in ways that would influence world history for generations to come. The morning mist clung to the Thames as Victoria entered the most transformative period of her reign, when the very concept of empire would evolve from scattered territories into a unified global system. The year 1845 dawned with unprecedented challenges that would test every administrative innovation she and Albert had carefully constructed. In her private chambers, the Queen would rise before the servants stirred, her mind already racing through the complex web of decisions that awaited her attention across 6 continents. Her breakfast table had become a battlefield of competing priorities, where urgent telegrams from the northwest frontier of India lay beside equally pressing reports from the newly established colonies of New Zealand. Victoria would sip her morning tea while absorbing accounts of Maori resistance to British settlement, her free hand gently stroking the hair of her youngest child, who slept peacefully in her lap. The juxtaposition of maternal tenderness and imperial authority had become the defining characteristic of her daily existence. The Queen's morning audiences now included a steady stream of explorers and missionaries returning from territories that existed beyond the edges of even the most detailed maps. She would receive these Sunway adventurers in the green drawing room, where their tales of African kingdoms and Pacific archipelagos filled her imagination with visions of future expansion. Dr. David Livingstone would describe his encounters with tribal chieftains who ruled territories larger than Scotland, while naval officers presented charts of island chains that could serve as stepping stones for British influence across the world's most remote waters. Victoria's correspondence during this period revealed her growing understanding of how cultural sensitivity could serve strategic purposes more effectively than military coercion. Her letters to colonial governors emphasized the importance of learning local languages and customs, recognizing that administrators who could communicate directly with indigenous populations would achieve better results than those who relied solely on interpreters and intimidation. She supported the establishment of schools where British and local children learned together, understanding that educational integration would create loyalty more lasting than any imposed. Through force, the royal study had expanded to accommodate the flood of intelligence flowing from territories whose administration required increasingly sophisticated coordination. Maps covered every wall, their surfaces marked with colored pins representing military garrisons, commercial centers, and diplomatic missions that maintained British influence across regions, spanning multiple climate zones and cultural traditions. Victoria would spend her afternoons tracing trade routes with her finger while dictating responses to governors who sought guidance on everything from tax collection procedures to marriage laws that needed to accommodate both British legal principles and local customs. Prince Albert's methodical approach to imperial administration had created new efficiencies that enabled more effective governance of territories whose combined area now exceeded that of Europe and Asia combined. His morning routine included detailed analysis of economic reports, showing how raw materials from colonial territories were being transformed in British factories into manufactured goods that were then exported back to colonial markets, creating cycles of dependency that strengthened imperial bonds while generating enormous profits for British merchants and investors. The Queen's afternoon walks through the palace gardens had become mobile strategy sessions where she and Albert would discuss the delicate balance required to maintain imperial unity while accommodating the legitimate aspirations of diverse populations seeking greater self-governance. They understood that successful long-term administration required gradual transfer of certain responsibilities to local officials who possessed intimate knowledge of regional conditions and could implement policies with greater sensitivity than administrators appointed directly from London. Victoria's evening hours were increasingly devoted to correspondence with the wives and daughters of colonial officials, creating informal networks of communication that provided insights into social conditions throughout the empire. These letters revealed how British families were adapting to life in tropical climates and frontier settlements, while also describing how their presence was affecting local communities. The Queen learned about everything from medical challenges in equatorial territories to educational innovations in temperate colonies, where British and indigenous children were learning to read from the same textbooks. Her daily routine included regular consultations with military engineers who were planning infrastructure projects that would bind distant territories together through networks of roads, railways, and telegraph lines. Victoria studied detailed proposals for railway construction across the Indian subcontinent, understanding how these transportation arteries would enable rapid deployment of troops during emergencies, while also facilitating commercial development that would benefit both British investors and local populations. She grasped the strategic importance of infrastructure investments that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The Queen's breakfast conversations with returning colonial official brought vivid descriptions of ceremonial events, where traditional rulers formally accepted British protection while maintaining their authority over local affairs. She listened intently to accounts of elaborate ceremonies, where ancient crowns were placed alongside British flags in rituals that acknowledge both imperial authority and indigenous sovereignty. These diplomatic innovations created models for expansion that minimized resistance while establishing clear frameworks for British oversight of regional governance. Victoria's correspondence with military commanders revealed her growing sophistication in understanding how limited British forces could maintain control over territories whose populations vastly outnumbered the available troops. Her letters emphasized the importance of recruiting local auxiliaries who could serve alongside British regulars, creating mixed units that combined European military discipline with indigenous knowledge of local terrain and tactics. She supported initiatives that would train colonial officers to command these integrated forces effectively. The Royal Nursery continued to serve as an unlikely center of imperial education, as Victoria's children absorbed geographical knowledge through games that incorporated the exotic locations their mother governed. Young Prince Albert Edward would build elaborate fortifications with wooden blocks, while his mother reviewed reports from Gibraltar unconsciously, learning about strategic positioning through play. Princess Victoria would dress her dolls in costumes representing different colonial populations, inadvertently gaining appreciation for the cultural diversity that characterized the expanding empire. Prince Albert's systematic approach to intelligence gathering had created comprehensive understanding of how local conditions in different territories affected broader imperial interests. His morning routine included careful analysis of weather reports, crop yields, and population movements that could indicate emerging challenges or opportunities requiring royal attention. The Prince Consort developed innovative, analytical methods that enabled identification of patterns across multiple territories, providing early warning of potential problems that might otherwise escape notice until they became serious crises. Victoria's daily schedule reflected the accelerating pace of technological innovation that was transforming imperial communication and transportation. Steam-powered vessels could now carry messages between London and Bombay in just 6 weeks, while experimental telegraph lines were being constructed across vast distances to enable even faster coordination between colonial administrators and their superiors in the imperial capital. The Queen understood how these innovations would revolutionize governance by enabling more direct oversight of distant territories. Her approach to territorial acquisition during this period emphasized careful evaluation of potential costs and benefits rather than opportunistic expansion that might strain imperial resources without providing substantial strategic advantages. Victoria insisted on detailed analysis of proposed acquisitions, considering not only immediate military and commercial benefits, but also long-term implications for imperial stability and administrative efficiency. She supported expansion that would strengthen British security while avoiding commitments that might prove impossible to maintain effectively. The Queen's afternoon audiences with merchants and traders brought first-hand accounts of commercial opportunities in territories that remained largely unexplored by European entrepreneurs. She listened to descriptions of mineral deposits in African territories, agricultural potential in Australian regions, and trading possibilities with Pacific Island communities that had maintained their independence while developing commercial relationships with British merchants. These conversations informed her understanding of how economic development could serve imperial expansion more effectively than military conquest. Victoria's evening correspondence included detailed discussions with colonial governors about the challenges of implementing British legal systems in territories where traditional customs governed most aspects of daily life. Her letters revealed genuine concern for developing judicial procedures that would maintain essential British legal principles while accommodating local practices that did not conflict with imperial authority. She supported experimental approaches that would test different methods of legal integration before implementing them throughout entire regions. The royal couple's joint oversight of imperial finances had created unprecedented understanding of how colonial revenues could fund continued expansion while also supporting development projects that would benefit local populations. Their breakfast discussions included detailed analysis of tax collection procedures, trade, statistics, and infrastructure investments that would generate future income while demonstrating British commitment to improving living conditions throughout the empire. Victoria's daily routine included regular reviews of educational initiatives designed to create literate populations who could participate effectively in the expanding commercial and administrative networks that connected distant territories. She supported the establishment of schools where instruction was provided in both English and local languages, understanding that bilingual education would create colonial subjects who could serve as intermediaries between British authorities and indigenous populations while maintaining their cultural identities. The Queen's morning briefings increasingly included reports from territories where British influence was being established through diplomatic agreements rather than military occupation. She learned about negotiations with African kingdoms whose rulers accepted British protection in exchange for exclusive trading privileges, creating relationships that provided imperial advantages without requiring expensive military commitments. These diplomatic innovations offered models for expansion that could be replicated in other regions where direct conquest might prove too costly or politically problematic. Prince Albert's role as royal consort had evolved to include direct oversight of colonial intelligence operations that provided comprehensive information about conditions throughout the empire. His analytical capabilities enabled identification of connections between seemingly unrelated events in different territories, while his systematic approach to information processing ensured that important developments did not escape royal attention. The Prince Consort's summaries became essential reading for ministers responsible for imperial policy formulation and implementation. Victoria's afternoon walks through the palace grounds provided opportunities for informal discussions with visiting colonial officials who could describe local conditions with greater candor than formal written reports typically allowed. These conversations revealed both successes and failures in imperial administration, helping the Queen understand which policies were achieving their intended objectives and which required modification or abandonment. Her ability to process critical feedback without defensiveness enabled continuous improvement in imperial governance. The Queen's evening hours were devoted to correspondence that maintained personal relatio, enships with administrators throughout the empire, creating networks of loyalty that transcended formal governmental hierarchies. Her letters to colonial officials combined official guidance with personal interest in their families and circumstances, demonstrating royal concern that strengthened imperial bonds while providing additional channels for information about local conditions and challenges. As 1846 approached, Victoria had established administrative systems that could accommodate continued territorial expansion while maintaining the quality of governance that preserved imperial unity across vast distances and diverse populations. Her daily routine of processing information from multiple continents while managing complex family responsibilities had created new models for royal authority that would influence monarchical traditions throughout the civilized world. The empire stood ready for another phase of unprecedented growth, with opportunities emerging that would test every aspect of the governmental innovations the royal couple had developed during their remarkable partnership in imperial leadership. Victoria's morning routine would soon encompass territories whose names remained unknown to European geographers as British influence continued spreading through networks of commerce, diplomacy, and carefully planned expansion that were reshaping global civilization according to principles of ordered progress and beneficial development. The dawn light filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Victoria entered what historians would later recognize as the most decisive decade of imperial expansion in human history. The year 1847 brought with it a cascade of events that would transform scattered colonial possessions into the most powerful empire the world had ever witnessed. In her private apartments, the Queen would awaken each morning to find her writing desk laden with dispatches that chronicled the systematic extension of British authority into regions whose very existence had been mere speculation just a generation earlier. Her morning ritual had evolved into a complex choreography of imperial oversight, where she would nurse her latest child while simultaneously reviewing intelligence reports from territories spanning every climate zone on Earth. The soft cooing of Prince Arthur, born just months earlier, provided a gentle counterpoint to discussions of frontier warfare in Afghanistan and commercial negotiations in the treaty ports of China. Victoria had learned to shift seamlessly between the intimate demands of motherhood and the vast responsibilities of governing populations that now numbered in the hundreds of millions. The Queen's breakfast conversations with Prince Albert had become the unofficial nerve center of imperial decision-making, where policies affecting entire continents were formulated between sips of Earl Grey tea and bites of buttered toast. Their dining room table served as an impromptu map room where charts of unexplored African territories lay beside reports from Australian gold prospectors, whose discoveries were attracting thousands of fortune seekers from across the British Isles. The couple had developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's thoughts, enabling them to process enormous amounts of complex information with remarkable efficiency. Victoria's mid-AM morning audiences now included a steady procession of adventurers and entrepreneurs whose ambitions perfectly aligned with imperial objectives. She would receive these visitors in the crimson drawing room, where their weathered faces and exotic tales transported her imagination to landscapes she would never see, but whose destinies she would ultimately control. Captain James Ross would describe the Antarctic territory he had claimed for the crown, while merchants fresh from Singapore painted vivid pictures of trading opportunities that could generate revenues exceeding those of entire European nations. The royal correspondence during this period revealed Victoria's growing mastery of the subtle diplomacy required to maintain relationships with indigenous rulers, whose cooperation was essential for peaceful expansion. Her letters to tribal chieftains and local potentates combined respectful acknowledgement of their traditional authority with firm assertions of British interests, creating frameworks for mutual benefit that avoided the enormous costs of military conquest. She had learned that a carefully worded message accompanied by appropriate gifts could achieve more lasting results than entire regiments of soldiers. Prince Albert's systematic approach to colonial intelligence had created unprecedented awareness of how developments in one territory could affect stability throughout the empire. His morning routine included detailed analysis of meteorological reports that predicted monsoon patterns affecting Indian agriculture, economic surveys that tracked trade flows between different colonial regions, and demographic studies that revealed population movements requiring administrative attention. The prince consort had transformed scattered information into comprehensive understanding of imperial interconnections. The Queen's afternoon hours were devoted to the intricate task of coordinating military deployments across territories, where seasonal variations meant that troops might be fighting in tropical heat, while their colleagues battled winter storms on the opposite side of the globe. She would study deployment charts while her children played with toy soldiers on the Persian carpets, unconsciously learning about strategic positioning through games that mirrored their mother's AC. Tulle military planning. The royal nursery had become an inadvertent academy of imperial strategy. Victoria's evening walks through the palace gardens provided opportunities for private consultations with returning colonial administrators who could speak candidly about challenges that might be minimized in official reports. These informal conversations revealed the human dimensions of imperial expansion as seasoned officials described the daily realities of implementing British authority among populations whose languages, customs, and beliefs differed dramatically from European traditions. The Queen absorbed these insights with genuine fascination, understanding that successful governance required appreciation for cultural complexities. Her daily correspondence had expanded to include regular exchanges with the wives of colonial officials, creating informal networks of communication that provided invaluable insights into social conditions throughout the empire. These letters revealed how British families were adapting to life in environments ranging from Canadian logging camps to Indian hill stations, while also describing the impact of European presence on local communities. Victoria learned about everything from medical innovations developed in tropical climates to educational experiments where British and Indigenous children learned together in multilingual classrooms. The Queen's morning briefings increasingly included reports from territories where British influence was being established through commercial penetration rather than political annexation. She studied detailed accounts of trading relationships with African kingdoms, whose rulers welcomed European merchants while maintaining their political independence, creating models for expansion that avoided the administrative burdens of direct governance. These commercial partnerships offered templates for extending British influence without triggering international opposition or straining imperial resources. Prince Albert's role had evolved to encompass direct oversight of the technological innovations that were revolutionizing imperial communication, transportation. His afternoon schedule included consultations with engineers who were planning telegraph lines across vast distances, railway routes through challenging terrain, and steamship services that would connect distant territories with unprecedented speed and reliability. The Prince Consort grasped how these infrastructure investments would transform imperial administration by enabling real-time coordination between London and the furthest outposts of British authority. Victoria's daily routine reflected the accelerating pace of territorial acquisition as opportunities for expansion emerged faster than traditional governmental procedures could accommodate them. The discovery of gold in California had triggered a massive migration that included thousands of British subjects seeking their fortunes in American territories, while similar mineral discoveries in Australia were attracting settlers whose success would strengthen imperial bonds through shared prosperity. The Queen understood how these population movements were reshaping global demographics in ways that favored British interests. Her approach to expansion during this period emphasized the establishment of strategic positions that could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Naval bases established for military reasons also functioned as commercial centers and diplomatic outposts, while trading stations developed into administrative centers that gradually extended British authority over surrounding regions. Victoria supported initiatives that maximized the return on imperial investments by creating facilities that could adapt to changing circumstances and expanding opportunities. The Queen's afternoon audiences with merchants and explorers brought vivid descriptions of territories that offered both enormous potential and significant challenges for imperial development. She listened intently to accounts of river systems that could provide transportation arteries into the heart of unexplored continents, mineral deposits that could fund decades of expansion, and agricultural regions that could feed growing colonial populations while generating export revenues. These conversations informed her understanding of how natural resources could be developed to serve imperial objectives. Victoria's evening correspondence included detailed discussions with military commanders about the strategic implications of technological advances that were changing the nature of warfare itself. The development of rifled firearms, explosive shells, and steam-powered warships was giving British forces decisive advantages over potential enemies, while improvements in medical knowledge were reducing the casualties that had previously made tropical campaigns prohibitively expensive. She grasped how these innovations were expanding the range of territories that could be conquered and held with acceptable costs. The royal couple's joint oversight of imperial finances had created sophisticated understanding of how colonial revenues could be reinvested to generate even greater returns through carefully planned development projects. Their breakfast discussions included analysis of tax collection procedures that balanced imperial revenue requirements with local economic conditions, infrastructure investments that would stimulate commercial growth while serving strategic purposes, and educational initiatives that would create skilled populations capable of contributing to imperial prosperity. Victoria's daily schedule included regular reviews of diplomatic initiatives designed to prevent European rivals from establishing competing influences in regions where British interests were expanding. Her correspondence with foreign monarchs combined personal relationships with strategic calculations, using royal connections to advance imperial objectives while maintaining the appearance of friendly cooperation. She understood how diplomatic success could achieve territorial gains without the enormous costs of military campaigns. The Queen's morning routine now encompassed territories whose administration required unprecedented coordination between different governmental departments and colonial authorities. She might review reports from the India Office about railway construction projects, while simultaneously considering Foreign Office recommendations about diplomatic relations with Chinese authorities, then shift to Colonial Office briefings about Australian immigration policies. Her ability to synthesize information from multiple sources enabled more effective policy coordination. Prince Albert's systematic approach to intelligence analysis had revealed patterns of global development that informed long-term imperial strategy. As his morning reports identified emerging opportunities and potential challenges that might affect British interests in future decades, the Prince Consort's analytical capabilities enabled the royal couple to anticipate developments, rather than merely responding to events after they occurred, providing strategic advantages that their rivals could not match. Victoria's afternoon walks through the palace grounds had become mobile, planning sessions where she and Albert would discuss the delicate balance required to maintain imperial unity, while accommodating the legitimate aspirations of diverse populations seeking greater participation in their own governance. They understood that sustainable expansion required policy that created loyalty through shared benefits, rather than mere submission enforced through military occupation. The Queen's evening hours were devoted to correspondence that maintained personal relationships with administrators throughout the empire, creating networks of loyalty that transcended formal governmental hierarchies while providing additional channels for information about local conditions and emerging challenges. Her letters combined official guidance with genuine personal interest, demonstrating royal concern that strengthened imperial bonds while encouraging honest reporting about both successes and failures in colonial administration. Her daily correspondence revealed growing sophistication in understanding how economic development could serve imperial expansion more effectively than military conquest alone. Victoria supported initiatives that would create prosperity for colonial populations while generating revenues that could fund further expansion. Understanding that willing cooperation based on mutual benefit would prove more durable than reluctant submission enforced through coercion. The Queen's morning audiences included consultations with medical officers who described health challenges in different climate zones and the innovative treatments being developed to protect British personnel serving in tropical territories. She learned about vaccination programs that were reducing disease casualties, dietary modifications that improved survival rates, and architectural innovations that made European habitation more comfortable in extreme environments. These medical advances were expanding the range of territories that could be effectively occupied and administered. Victoria's breakfast conversations with Prince Albert increasingly focused on the educational initiatives that would create literate populations capable of participating in the commercial and administrative networks connecting distant territories. Their discussions included detailed analysis of curriculum development, teacher training programs, and multilingual instruction methods that would enable colonial subjects to serve as intermediaries between British authorities and local communities, while maintaining their cultural identities. Royal Study had been transformed into a command centre where information from every continent converged for analysis and decision-making. Maps covering the walls were updated daily with new territorial acquisitions, population movements, and commercial developments, while filing systems organised by Prince Albert enabled rapid access to relevant information when crises required immediate attention. The room had become the beating heart of an empire whose pulse could be felt simultaneously across 6 continents. Victoria's daily routine included regular consultations with naval officers who coordinated the fleet deployments that protected British commerce, while projecting imperial power across the world's oceans. She studied charts showing patrol routes that ensured safe passage for merchant vessels while maintaining British presence in strategic waterways. Understanding how naval supremacy provided the foundation for all other aspects of imperial expansion, the Queen grasped the delicate calculations required to balance global commitments with available resources. Her evening correspondence maintained connections with colonial officials, whose families had settled permanently in distant territories, creating communities of British subjects who served as anchors for imperial authority while adapting to local conditions. These letters revealed how expatriate communities were developing distinct identities that combined British traditions with local influences, creating new forms of imperial citizenship that strengthened, rather than weakened bonds with the mother country. Prince Albert's role as royal consort had expanded to include oversight of the commercial relationships that generated much of the empire's wealth, as his analytical skills proved valuable for identifying market opportunities and potential disruptions to establish trade patterns. His morning routine included detailed analysis of commodity prices, shipping schedules, and commercial agreements that affected everything from tea cultivation in Ceylon to wool production in Australia. Victoria's afternoon audiences with returning missionaries brought accounts of their efforts to spread Christianity and British values among indigenous populations, while also providing valuable intelligence about local conditions and potential opportunities for expansion. She listened to descriptions of educational and medical work that was creating goodwill toward British authority. Understanding how humanitarian initiatives could serve strategic purposes while genuinely improving living conditions for colonial subjects. The Queen's daily schedule reflected the growing complexity of governing territories where seasonal variations meant that agricultural planning, military operations, and commercial activities had to be coordinated across multiple time zones and climate cycles. She might spend her morning reviewing harvest reports from Canadian wheat fields, while simultaneously planning military deployments for the upcoming campaigning season in India, then shift to discussions about shipping schedules that would transport Australian wool to British textile mills. Her approach to imperial governance during this period emphasized the development of local administrative capabilities that could maintain British authority, while reducing the need for direct oversight from London. Victoria supported training programs that would prepare colonial subject CTS for governmental responsibilities, understanding that effective delegation would enable continued expansion without overwhelming the imperial bureaucracy with administrative burdens. The Queen's evening walks through the palace gardens provided opportunities for reflection on the remarkable transformation that had occurred during her decade of rule. The scattered territory she had inherited had been forged into a unified system of global authority that influenced the daily lives of populations from the Arctic Circle to the Southern Ocean. Her quiet contemplation of these achievements was accompanied by awareness that even greater challenges and opportunities lay ahead as the empire stood poised for expansion into regions that would test every aspect of the administrative innovations she and Albert had developed together. The crimson sunrise of 1848 painted the windows of Buckingham Palace as Victoria awakened to news that would forever alter the trajectory of human civilization. Her lady-in-waiting approached with unusual urgency, carrying dispatches that bore the seals of territories whose names had become synonymous with British greatness. The Queen stirred beneath her silk coverlets, instinctively knowing that this morning would bring revelations that would reshape not merely her empire, but the very concept of global authority itself. In her private chambers, Victoria's morning ritual began with the gentle placement of her newest infant, Princess Louise, at her breast, while her free hand reached for the leather portfolio containing overnight telegrams from across her dominions. The soft suckling sounds of the nursing child mingled with the rustle of official papers as the Queen absorbed reports of gold discoveries in the Australian territories that promised to transform the economic foundations of imperial expansion. These distant mineral strikes would attract hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers whose success would bind the colonies ever more tightly to British interests through shared prosperity. Her breakfast table had evolved into an impromptu war room where Prince Albert would spread detailed charts showing the revolutionary railway projects that were beginning to crisscross the Indian subcontinent. Steam engines were carving paths through landscapes that had remained unchanged since antiquity, their iron rails creating arteries of commerce that would pump British-manufactured goods into the most remote villages, while drawing raw materials back to the ports where ships waited to carry these treasures across the oceans to feed the hungry factories of Manchester and Birmingham. The Queen's morning audiences now included a remarkable parade of individuals whose adventures were expanding the boundaries of the known world with each passing month. She would receive these pioneers in the blue drawing room where their sun-weathered faces and exotic tales transported her imagination to landscapes of breathtaking beauty and untold wealth. Arctic explorers described ice-locked passages that might one day provide shortcuts to Asian markets, while African adventurers painted vivid pictures of river systems that could serve as highways into the heart of unexplored continents rich with ivory, gold, and precious stones. Victoria's correspondence during this extraordinary period revealed her masterful understanding of how personal relationships could serve strategic purposes more effectively than military intimidation. Her letters to indigenous rulers combined genuine respect for their cultural traditions with subtle assertions of British technological superiority, creating partnerships that achieve territorial expansion without the enormous costs of prolonged warfare. She had discovered that a carefully crafted message accompanied by demonstrations of British engineering, marvels could accomplish more than entire armies marching across hostile terrain. The Royal Nursery continued to serve as an unexpected centre of geographical education, where Victoria's children absorbed knowledge of distant territories through games that incorporated the exotic locations their mother governed with increasing confidence and sophistication. Young Prince Albert Edward would construct elaborate harbour fortifications with his wooden blocks while listening to his mother discuss naval deployments in the Mediterranean, unconsciously learning strategic principles that would serve him well when his own turn came to shoulder imperial responsibilities. Prince Albert's systematic approach to intelligence gathering had created unprecedented awareness of how seasonal variations in distant territories affected everything from agricultural production to military campaign planning. His morning routine included meticulous analysis of monsoon patterns that determined crop yields across the Indian subcontinent, shipping schedules that coordinated with favorable wind patterns for maximum efficiency, and diplomatic calendars that aligned British initiatives with local festivals and ceremonial seasons when indigenous populations would be most receptive to negotiations. The Queen's afternoon hours were devoted to the delicate art of coordinating military operations across territories where geographical and climatic conditions varied so dramatically that troops might simultaneously battle mountain insurgents in Afghanistan while their colleagues pursued diplomatic initiatives in the tropical ports of Southeast Asia. She would study deployment maps while her children played elaborate games of empire on the Persian carpets, their innocent recreations mirroring the actual strategic decisions their mother made with such remarkable skill and foresight. Victoria's evening strolls through the palace gardens had transformed into mobile strategy sessions where she and Albert would discuss the technological innovations that were revolutionizing imperial communication faster than anyone had thought possible. Telegraph lines were beginning to span vast distances, enabling messages to travel in hours rather than months, while steam-powered vessels could now carry urgent dispatches between London and Kolkata in mere weeks. These advances were compressing the empire's vast distances into manageable proportions that allowed for unprecedented coordination between colonial administrators and their superiors in the imperial capital. Her daily correspondence had expanded to encompass regular exchanges with the families of colonial officials whose wives provided invaluable insights into social conditions throughout the empire that never appeared in formal governmental reports. These letters revealed how British communities were adapting to life in environments ranging from the frozen outposts of Hudson Bay to the sweltering plantations of Ceylon, while also describing the gradual changes their presence was producing in local societies. Victoria absorbed these accounts with genuine fascination, understanding that cultural integration would prove more valuable than political domination for ensuring long-term imperial stability. The Queen's morning briefings increasingly included detailed reports from territories where British influence was expanding through commercial penetration rather than military conquest, creating models for growth that avoided international complications while generating enormous profits for imperial investors. She studied accounts of trading relationships with kingdoms whose rulers welcomed European merchants while maintaining their political independence, understanding how these partnerships could RVE as stepping stones for eventual territorial acquisition when circumstances proved favorable. Prince Albert's role had evolved to include direct oversight of the infrastructure projects that were binding distant territories together through networks of roads, railways, and communication systems that would endure for generations. His afternoon consultations with engineers and surveyors revealed plans for transportation arteries that would enable rapid movement of troops during emergencies while facilitating commercial development that benefited both British investors and local populations seeking opportunities for economic advancement. Victoria's daily routine reflected the breathtaking pace of territorial acquisition as opportunities for expansion emerged with such frequency that traditional governmental procedures struggled to process them adequately. The California gold rush had attracted thousands of British subjects whose success in American territories demonstrated the global reach of imperial ambition, while similar mineral discoveries in Australian colonies were creating boom towns that rivaled established European cities in their prosperity and sophistication. Her approach to expansion during this remarkable period emphasized the establishment of strategic positions that could serve multiple purposes simultaneously, maximizing the return on imperial investments while creating foundations for future growth. Naval bases developed for military reasons also functioned as commercial centers and diplomatic outposts, while trading stations gradually evolved into administrative centers that extended British authority over surrounding regions through patient negotiation, rather than forceful conquest. The Queen's afternoon audiences with merchants and explorers brought increasingly exciting descriptions of territories that offered both enormous potential and manajab, the challenges for imperial development. She listened with growing enthusiasm to accounts of river systems that provided natural highways into previously inaccessible regions, agricultural zones that could support large populations while generating substantial export revenues, and mineral deposits that promised to fund decades of continued expansion across multiple continents. Victoria's evening correspondence included sophisticated discussions with military commanders about how technological advances were changing the fundamental nature of warfare in ways that consistently favored British interests. The development of rifled weapons, explosive, artillery, and armored warships was providing British forces with decisive advantages over potential enemies, while improvements in medical knowledge were dramatically reducing the casualty rates that had previously made tropical campaigns prohibitively expensive for European powers. The royal couple's joint oversight of imperial finances had created remarkable understanding of how colonial revenues could be systematically reinvested to generate even greater returns through carefully planned development projects that served both strategic and humanitarian purposes. Their breakfast discussions include a detailed analysis of taxation policies that balanced imperial revenue requirements with local economic conditions, infrastructure investments that stimulated commercial growth while serving military objectives, and educational initiatives that created skilled populations capable of contributing meaningfully to imperial prosperity. Victoria's daily schedule now encompassed the coordination of activities across territories whose combined area exceeded that of all other European empires combined, requiring unprecedented cooperation between different governmental departments and colonial authorities scattered across 6 continents. E might simultaneously review reports about railway construction in India, while considering diplomatic initiatives in China, then shift seamlessly to discussions about immigration policies in Australia that would determine the character of colonial society for generations to come. Prince Albert's systematic approach to intelligence analysis had revealed global patterns of development that informed long-term imperial strategy, as his morning reports identified emerging opportunities and potential challenges that might affect British interests in future decades. The Prince Consort's analytical capabilities enabled the royal couple to anticipate developments, rather than merely responding to events after they occurred, providing strategic advantages that their European rivals found impossible to match or counter effectively. Victoria's afternoon walks through the palace grounds had become essential planning sessions where she and Albert would discuss the delicate balance required to maintain imperial unity while accommodating the legitimate aspirations of diverse populations seeking greater participation in their own governance. They understood that sustainable expansion required policies that created genuine loyalty through shared prosperity rather than mere submission, enforced through military occupation and bureaucratic intimidation. The Queen's evening hours were devoted to correspondence that maintained personal relationships with administrators throughout the empire, creating informal networks of communication that transcended official governmental hierarchies, while providing valuable channels for information about local conditions and emerging opportunities. Her letters combined authoritative guidance with sincere personal interest, demonstrating royal concern that strengthened imperial bonds while encouraging honest reporting about both remarkable successes and occasional setbacks in colonial administration. Her Morning audiences now included consultations with medical officers who described the health innovations being developed to protect British personnel serving in challenging environments, ranging from Arctic exploration stations to tropical administrative centres. She learned about vaccination programs that were virtually eliminating disease, casualties, dietary modifications that dramatically improved survival rates, and architectural innovations that made European habitation comfortable and productive in the most extreme climates on Earth. Victoria's breakfast conversations with Prince Albert increasingly focused on the educational initiatives that would create literate populations capable of participating effectively in the expanding commercial and administrative networks that connected distant territories with unprecedented efficiency. Their discussions included comprehensive analysis of curriculum development, teacher training programs, and multilingual instruction methods that would enable colonial subjects to serve as skilled intermediaries between British authorities and local communities while proudly maintaining their distinctive cultural identities. The royal study had been completely transformed into a command centre where information from every inhabited continent converged for careful analysis and decisive action. Maps covering every wall were updated continuously with new territorial acquisitions, population movements, and commercial developments, while filing systems organized with Germanic precision enabled immediate access to relevant information when unexpected crises demanded rapid royal attention and authoritative resolution. Victoria's daily routine included regular consultations with naval commanders who coordinated the fleet deployments that protected British commerce while projecting imperial power. Across strategic waterways from the English Channel to the South China Sea, she studied detailed charts showing patrol routes that ensured safe passage for merchant vessels while maintaining British presence in key locations, understanding how naval supremacy provided the essential foundation for every other aspect of imperial expansion and commercial development. Her evening correspondence maintained vital connections with colonial officials whose families had established permanent settlements in distant territories, creating stable communities of British subjects who served as reliable anchors for imperial authority, while successfully adapting to local conditions and opportunities. These letters revealed how expatriate communities were developing distinctive identities that skillfully combined cherished British traditions with valuable local influences, creating innovative forms of imperial citizenship that actually strengthened rather than weakened their emotional and practical bonds with the mother country. The Queen's approach to imperial governance during this transformative period emphasized the systematic development of local administrative capabilities that could effectively maintain British authority while reducing the need for expensive direct oversight from London bureaucrats. Victoria enthusiastically supported comprehensive training programs that would prepare qualified colonial subjects for significant governmental responsibilities, understanding that intelligent delegation would enable continued expansion without overwhelming the imperial bureaucracy with unmanageable administrative burdens. Prince Albert's role as royal consort had expanded significantly to include detailed oversight of the commercial relationships that generated much of the empire's spectacular wealth, as his exceptional analytical skills proved invaluable for identifying profitable market opportunities and potential disruptions to well-established trade patterns. His morning routine included systematic analysis of commodity prices, shipping schedules, and commercial agreements that affected everything from tea cultivation in the highlands of Ceylon to wool production across the vast Australian territories. Victoria's afternoon audiences with returning missionaries brought fascinating accounts of their efforts to spread Christian values and British educational methods among indigenous populations, while simultaneously providing extremely valuable intelligence about local conditions and emerging opportunities for beneficial expansion. She listened with genuine interest to detailed descriptions of medical and educational work that was creating substantial goodwill toward British authority, understanding how humanitarian initiatives could serve important strategic purposes while authentically improving living conditions for grateful colonial subjects. The Queen's daily schedule reflected the remarkable complexity of governing territories where seasonal variations meant that agricultural, planning, military operations, and commercial activities had to be carefully coordinated across multiple time zones and dramatically different climate cycles. She might spend her morning reviewing optimistic harvest reports from Canadian wheat fields, while simultaneously planning military deployments for the upcoming campaigning season in India, then shift effortlessly to discussions about shipping schedules that would transport valuable Australian wool to hungry British textile mills. Her evening walks through the palace gardens provided precious opportunities for quiet reflection on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred during her eventful decade of rule. The scattered territories she had inherited as a young and inexperienced sovereign had been systematically forged into a unified system of global authority that directly influenced the daily lives of populations stretching from the icy shores of Newfoundland to the tropical islands of the Pacific Ocean. Victoria's contemplation of these remarkable achievements was accompanied by growing awareness that even greater challenges and unprecedented opportunities lay ahead on the horizon. As the empire stood confidently poised for expansion into regions that would test every aspect of the sophisticated administrative innovations she and Albert had developed together through years of patient cooperation and shared dedication. The morning mist that rose from the Thames seemed to carry whispers of destiny, as 1849 dawned with promises of transformation that would eclipse even the remarkable achievements of previous years. In her private chambers, Victoria would awaken each day to find her writing desk covered with reports that chronicled the systematic expansion of British influence into territories whose very names had been unknown to European geographers just months earlier. The soft breathing of her sleeping children provided a gentle counterpoint to the momentous decisions that shaped the lives of millions across every inhabited continent. The Queen's morning ritual now included nursing Prince Arthur while simultaneously reviewing intelligence reports from the goldfields of California and Australia, where British subjects were striking fortunes that would fund decades of imperial expansion. Her ability to balance the intimate demands of motherhood with the vast responsibilities of global governance had become the defining characteristic of her remarkable reign, as she demonstrated daily that feminine, nurturing, and imperial authority could combine to create unprecedented effectiveness in managing the world's most complex governmental challenges. Victoria's breakfast table had evolved into the unofficial headquarters of a global enterprise whose operations spanned every ocean and climate zone, where decisions made over morning tea would affect the destinies of populations from the frozen territories of northern Canada to the sun-baked plains of central India. Prince Albert would unfold detailed engineering reports describing the railway lines that were beginning to bind the subcontinent together with ribbons of steel, creating transportation networks that would enable British authority to reach into valleys and plateaus that had remained isolated since the dawn of civilization. Her daily correspondence revealed a monarch whose understanding of imperial strategy had evolved far beyond the simple territorial acquisition that characterized earlier periods of expansion. Victoria's letters to colonial governors emphasized the importance of developing local industries that would create prosperity for indigenous populations, while generating revenues that could fund further growth. Understanding that willing cooperation based on mutual benefit would prove infinitely more valuable than reluctant submission, enforced through military occupation and bureaucratic coercion. The Royal Nursery continued to serve as an inadvertent academy of global geography where Victoria's children absorbed knowledge of distant territories through elaborate games that incorporated the exotic locations their mother governed with increasing skill and confidence. Princess Victoria would dress her collection of dolls in costumes representing different colonial populations, unconsciously developing appreciation for the remarkable cultural diversity that characterized the expanding empire, while learning to see these differences as sources of strength. rather than obstacles to overcome. Prince Albert's systematic intelligence gathering had created comprehensive understanding of how meteorological patterns in one region could affect agricultural production, military operations, and commercial activities throughout the interconnected web of territories that comprise the British Empire. His morning analysis included detailed study of seasonal wind patterns that determined optimal shipping schedules, rainfall predictions that affected crop yields across multiple continents, and temperature variations that influenced everything from disease patterns to military campaign planning. Victoria's afternoon hours were devoted to coordinating the complex logistics required to maintain effective governance across territories, where geographical conditions varied so dramatically that administrative procedures developed for temperate climates required extensive modification for tropical environments. She would study detailed reports about architectural innovations that made European-style buildings comfortable in equatorial regions, medical advances that protected colonial personnel from tropical diseases, and educational methods that accommodated different learning traditions while maintaining British academic standards. The Queen's evening strolls through the palace gardens provided essential opportunities for private consultations with returning colonial administrators who could speak candidly about challenges that might be diplomatically minimized in formal written reports. These informal conversations revealed the human dimensions of imperial expansion as experienced officials described the daily realities of implementing British law among populations whose traditional customs had governed social relationships for countless generations. Her daily routine increasingly included audiences with inventors and engineers whose innovations were revolutionizing both military technology and civilian infrastructure in ways that consistently advanced British interests. Victoria listened with growing excitement to descriptions of new weapons that would provide decisive advantages in frontier conflicts, improved manufacturing techniques that would increase the competitiveness of British exports, and communication systems that would enable unprecedented coordination between London and the most distant colonial outposts. Victoria's morning briefings included detailed reports from territories where British influence was expanding through patient diplomatic negotiation rather than expensive military conquest, creating sustainable models for growth that avoided international complications, while establishing foundations for eventual political control when circumstances proved favorable. She studied accounts of commercial agreements with indigenous rulers who welcomed British merchants while maintaining nominal political independence, understanding how these relationships could evolve gradually into more formal imperial arrangements. The Queen's correspondence with military commanders revealed her sophisticated grasp of how limited British forces could maintain control over territories whose populations vastly outnumbered the available troops through strategic positioning and intelligent alliance building rather than simple numerical superiority. Her letters emphasized the importance of recruiting reliable local auxiliaries who could serve alongside British regulars, creating integrated units that combined European military discipline with indigenous knowledge of terrain and local political dynamics. Prince Albert's role had expanded to encompass direct oversight of the technological developments that were transforming imperial communication faster than anyone had previously thought possible. His afternoon schedule included regular consultations with telegraph engineers who were planning communication networks that would eventually connect every major colonial center with London, enabling real-time coordination of policy decisions across vast distances that had previously required months of delay for message transmission. Victoria's daily schedule reflected the accelerating pace of territorial acquisition as opportunities for expansion emerged with such frequency that traditional governmental procedures required constant modification to accommodate the flood of new responsibilities and administrative challenges. The discovery of precious metals in territories ranging from South Africa to British Columbia was attracting waves of immigration that would fundamentally alter the demographic composition of these regions, while strengthening their economic ties to the mother country. Her approach to expansion emphasized the establishment of infrastructure that would serve multiple strategic purposes simultaneously, maximizing returns on imperial investments while creating lasting foundations for continued growth. Railway construction projects served military, commercial, and administrative objectives, while port development facilitated both naval operations and civilian commerce, and telegraph installations enabled both governmental communication and commercial coordination across previously unmanageable distances. The Queen's afternoon audiences with merchants and explorers brought increasingly optimistic descriptions of territories that offered extraordinary potential for development with manageable risks and reasonable investment requirements. She listened with growing enthusiasm to accounts of agricultural regions that could support large populations, while generating substantial export revenues, mineral deposits that promised decades of profitable extraction, and strategic locations that could serve as basis for further expansion into adjacent territories. Victoria's evening correspondence included sophisticated discussions with colonial officials about the delicate balance required to maintain British authority while accommodating local customs and traditional leadership structures that commanded genuine popular respect. Her letters revealed understanding that sustainable imperial governance required flexibility and cultural sensitivity rather than rigid application of metropolitan procedures that might prove inappropriate for local conditions. The royal couple's joint oversight of imperial finances had created remarkable efficiency in allocating resources to projects that would generate both immediate returns and long-term strategic advantages. Their breakfast discussions included detailed analysis of infrastructure investments that would stimulate economic development, while serving military objectives, educational initiatives that would create skilled populations capable of contributing to imperial prosperity, and diplomatic expenditures that could achieve territorial gains without costly military campaigns. Victoria's morning routine now encompassed coordination between governmental departments whose responsibilities overlapped across multiple continents and diverse administrative challenges. She might simultaneously review Colonial Office reports about Australian immigration policies while considering Foreign Office recommendations about diplomatic relations with Chinese authorities. Then, shift to War Office briefings about military deployment patterns that affected security arrangements from India to Canada. Prince Albert's analytical capabilities had revealed global economic patterns that informed imperial trade policy, as his systematic study of commodity flows identified opportunities for British merchants while anticipating potential disruptions that could affect established commercial relationships. His morning reports enabled the royal couple to make strategic decisions about resource allocation and policy priorities based on comprehensive understanding of how local developments in distant territories affected broader imperial interests. Victoria's afternoon walks through the palace grounds had become essential planning sessions where she and Albert would discuss the long-term implications of current expansion policies, considering how territorial acquisitions made today would affect imperial capabilities and responsibilities in future decades. They understood that decisions made during this period of unprecedented growth would establish precedents and create commitments that would influence British policy for generations to come. The Queen's evening hours were devoted to maintaining the personal relationships that provided informal channels of communication throughout the empire, supplementing official governmental correspondence with private letters that encouraged honest reporting about both successes and challenges in colonial administration. Her ability to combine authoritative guidance with genuine personal interest created networks of loyalty that transcended formal bureaucratic hierarchies while providing valuable intelligence about local conditions. Victoria's daily correspondence revealed growing sophistication in understanding how economic development could serve imperial expansion more effectively than military coercion alone, as she supported initiatives that would create genuine prosperity for colonial populations while generating revenues that could fund continued growth. Her letters to colonial governors emphasized the importance of policies that would encourage local industries, improve agricultural productivity, and develop natural resources in ways that benefited both imperial investors and indigenous communities. The Queen's morning audiences included regular consultations with medical officers whose research was developing innovative treatments for tropical diseases that had previously made European settlement impossible in many regions. She learned about vaccination programs that were dramatically reducing mortality rates, dietary recommendations that improved health outcomes for colonial personnel, and architectural modifications that made European-style habitation comfortable and practical. In extreme climates, her breakfast conversations with Prince Albert increasingly focused on educational policies that would create literate populations capable of participating effectively in the commercial and administrative networks that connected distant territories with unprecedented efficiency and coordination. Their discussions included detailed consideration of curriculum development that would combine British academic standards with local cultural knowledge, teacher training programs that would prepare qualified instructors for diverse environments, and multilingual educational approaches that would preserve indigenous languages while ensuring proficiency in English. Victoria's daily routine included regular reviews of intelligence reports that revealed how technological innovations were creating new opportunities for territorial expansion and administrative efficiency throughout the empire. Steam-powered transportation was reducing travel times between major colonial centres, while improved manufacturing techniques were making British goods more competitive in global markets. And advanced weaponry was providing decisive advantages in conflicts with potentially hostile neighbours. The royal study had been transformed into a comprehensive command centre, where information from every continent converged for analysis and decision-making that would affect the daily lives of hundreds of millions of subjects scattered across territories spanning every climate zone and geographical environment. Filing systems organized with meticulous precision enabled immediate access to relevant documents when unexpected crises demanded rapid royal attention and authoritative resolution. Prince Albert's systematic approach to colonial intelligence had created unprecedented awareness of how seasonal variations, demographic trends, and economic cycles in different territories affected overall imperial stability and growth potential. His morning analysis enabled identification of emerging opportunities and potential challenges that might require policy adjustments or resource reallocation to maintain optimal administrative efficiency across the vast network of British possessions. Victoria's evening correspondence maintained essential connections with colonial administrators whose expertise and local knowledge provided invaluable guidance for policy formulation that took account of regional variations and cultural sensitivities. Her letters combined clear statements of imperial objectives with genuine interest in local conditions, creating relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to effective governance rather than simple hierarchical authority. The Queen's approach to imperial administration during this transformative period emphasized the development of local capabilities that could maintain British standards while adapting to regional circumstances, understanding that sustainable expansion required policies that created genuine loyalty through demonstrated benefits rather than mere compliance enforced through external pressure and bureaucratic intimidation. As the remarkable decade of the 1840s drew to its close, Victoria had established administrative systems that could accommodate continued territorial expansion, while maintaining the quality of governance that preserved imperial unity across distances that would have seemed impossible to manage just a generation earlier, creating foundations for an empire that would endure and prosper for generations yet to come. Greater than the Golden Dawn of 1850, illuminated the windows of Windsor Castle as Victoria prepared to face what would become the defining decade of her imperial legacy. In her private apartments, she would rise each morning to find correspondence waiting that chronicled the systematic transformation of scattered colonial possessions into the most cohesive global empire in human history. The gentle stirring of her youngest children, in their nursery beds, provided a peaceful backdrop to decisions that would reshape entire continents. According to British vision and administrative genius, her morning ritual had evolved into an intricate dance between maternal devotion and imperial oversight, where she might simultaneously comfort a teething infant while reviewing reports from territories whose combined populations now exceeded those of all European nations combined. The Queen had mastered the art of cradling Prince Leopold against her shoulder with one arm, while using her free hand to trace shipping routes on charts that showed how British commerce was penetrating markets from the Baltic Sea to the Indian Ocean with unprecedented efficiency and profitable results. Victoria's breakfast conversations with Prince Albert had become the unofficial nerve center of global governance, where policies affecting hundreds of millions of subjects were formulated between sips of dialing tea and careful consideration of buttered scones prepared by palace kitchens that now sourced ingredients from every corner of the expanding empire. Their dining room table served as an impromptu strategy center where detailed maps of African territories lay beside engineering reports describing the railway networks that were beginning to connect previously isolated regions of India through ribbons of steel that carried both British authority and commercial opportunity into valleys that had remained unchanged since ancient times. The royal correspondence during this extraordinary period revealed Victoria's mastery of the subtle diplomacy required to transform military victories into lasting administrative arrangements that serve both strategic objectives and humanitarian principles. Her letters to newly appointed governors emphasized the importance of establishing educational institutions that would prepare local populations for meaningful participation in imperial governance, while maintaining the cultural traditions that provided stability and continuity in societies adapting to profound changes in their political and economic circumstances. Prince Albert's systematic approach to intelligence analysis had created comprehensive understanding of how agricultural cycles in one territory could affect military planning in another region thousands of miles away, while demographic trends in colonial settlements influence shipping schedules and commercial investment patterns throughout the interconnected network of British possessions. His morning routine included meticulous study of rainfall predictions that determined crop yields across multiple continents, wind patterns that affected optimal sailing seasons for merchant vessels, and temperature variations that influenced everything from disease outbreaks to construction schedules for infrastructure projects. The Queen's afternoon hours were devoted to audiences with returning colonial administrators, whose weathered faces and exotic tales transported her imagination to landscapes she would never personally visit, but whose destinies she would ultimately control through careful policy formulation and strategic resource allocation. She would receive these experienced officials in the green drawing room, where their detailed accounts of local conditions provided insights that no written report could adequately convey about the human dimensions of imperial expansion and the daily challenges of implementing British authority among populations whose languages, customs, and traditional governance structures differed dramatically from European models. Victoria's evening strolls through the palace gardens had transformed into essential planning sessions, where she and Albert would discuss the technological innovations that were revolutionizing both military capabilities and civilian infrastructure in ways that consistently advanced British interests, while improving living conditions for colonial subjects. Telegraph lines were beginning to span continents, enabling messages to travel in days rather than months, while steam-powered vessels could transport urgent dispatches between London and distant territories with speed that compressed the Empire's vast distances into manageable proportions for effective administrative coordination. Her daily routine increasingly reflected the global scope of imperial responsibility, as morning briefings might include simultaneous consideration of Canadian timber exports, Australian wool production, Indian cotton cultivation, and South African mineral extraction, each requiring different approaches to taxation, labor management, and infrastructure development, while maintaining overall coherence in imperial economic policy. Victoria had developed remarkable ability to shift her attention seamlessly between these diverse challenges while maintaining comprehensive understanding of how decisions in one territory would affect conditions throughout the interconnected web of British possessions. The Royal Nursery continued to serve as an inadvertent centre of geographical education, where Victoria's children absorbed knowledge of distant territories through elaborate games that incorporated the exotic locations their mother governed with increasing confidence and sophisticated understanding. Young Prince Arthur would construct miniature fortifications with wooden blocks while listening to discussions of naval deployments in Mediterranean waters, unconsciously learning strategic principles that would serve imperial interests when his generation assumed responsibility for maintaining and expanding British global influence. Victoria's correspondence with indigenous rulers revealed her sophisticated grasp of how cultural sensitivity could achieve territorial objectives more effectively than military intimidation, as her letters combined respectful acknowledgement of traditional authority with subtle demonstrations of British technological superiority that encouraged voluntary cooperation rather than reluctant submission. She had discovered that carefully worded diplomatic initiatives accompanied by appropriate gifts and practical assistance could accomplish more lasting results than expensive military campaigns that generated resentment and required permanent garrison forces to maintain stability. The Queen's morning audiences now included consultations with medical officers whose research was developing innovative treatments for tropical diseases that had previously made European settlement impossible in vast regions of Africa and Asia. She learned about vaccination programs that were dramatically reducing mortality rates among colonial personnel, dietary modifications that improved health outcomes for families adapting to unfamiliar climates, and architectural innovations that made European-style construction comfortable and practical in environments ranging from equatorial rainforests to high-altitude mountain regions. Prince Albert's role had expanded to encompass direct oversight of the educational initiatives that would create literate populations capable of contributing meaningfully to imperial administration while maintaining their cultural identities and traditional social structures. His afternoon schedule included detailed consultations with curriculum developers who were creating instructional programs that combined British academic standards with local knowledge systems, teacher training initiatives that prepared qualified educators for diverse linguistic and cultural environments, and multilingual educational approaches that preserved indigenous languages while ensuring proficiency in English for commercial and administrative purposes. Victoria's daily schedule reflected the remarkable complexity of coordinating activities across territories where seasonal variations meant that agricultural planning, military operations, and commercial activities required careful synchronization across multiple time zones and dramatically different climate cycles. She might spend her morning reviewing optimistic harvest reports from Canadian wheat fields, while simultaneously planning military deployments for the upcoming monsoon season in Burma, then shift effortlessly to discussions about shipping schedules that would transport valuable New Zealand wool to British textile mills during optimal weather windows. Her approach to territorial expansion emphasized the establishment of infrastructure projects that would serve multiple strategic purposes, while generating immediate economic benefits for both imperial investors and local populations. Railway construction connected previously isolated regions to commercial networks, while enabling rapid troop movements during emergencies. Port development facilities accommodated both naval vessels and merchant shipping, while creating employment opportunities for indigenous workers, and telegraph installations provided governmental communication capabilities while supporting commercial coordination across vast distances. The Queen's evening correspondence maintained vital personal relationships with colonial administrators whose families had established permanent communities in distant territories, creating stable networks of British subjects who served as reliable anchors for imperial authority while adapting successfully to local conditions and opportunities. These letters revealed how expatriate settlements were developing distinctive identities that skillfully combined cherished British traditions with valuable local influences, creating innovative forms of imperial citizenship that strengthened rather than weakened emotional and practical bonds with the mother country. Victoria's morning briefings increasingly included reports from territories where British influence was expanding through commercial penetration and diplomatic negotiation rather than expensive military conquest, creating sustainable models for growth that avoided international complications while establishing foundations for eventual political control when circumstances prove favorable. She studied detailed accounts of trading agreements with African kingdoms whose rulers welcomed European merchants, while maintaining nominal independence. Understanding how these partnerships could evolve gradually into more formal imperial arrangements through patient cultivation and demonstrated mutual benefits. Prince Albert's systematic intelligence gathering had revealed global economic patterns that informed imperial trade policy, as his analytical capabilities enabled identification of market opportunities while anticipating potential disruptions to established commercial relationships. His morning reports provided comprehensive understanding of commodity flows, price fluctuations, and supply chain vulnerabilities that affected everything from tea cultivation in Sun to gold mining in South Africa, enabling strategic decisions about resource allocation and policy priorities based on accurate assessment of how local developments influenced broader imperial interests. The royal couple's joint oversight of imperial finances had created remarkable efficiency in allocating limited resources to projects that would generate both immediate returns and long-term strategic advantages for continued expansion and development. Their breakfast discussions included sophisticated analysis of infrastructure investments that would stimulate economic growth, while serving military objectives, educational expenditures that would create skilled populations capable of contributing to imperial prosperity, and diplomatic initiatives that could achieve territorial gains without costly military campaigns that drained imperial treasuries. Victoria's afternoon walks through the palace grounds provided essential opportunities for reflection on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred during her reign, as scattered colonial possessions had been systematically forged into a unified system of global authority that influenced the daily lives of populations stretching from Arctic territories to tropical islands across every ocean. Her quiet contemplation of these achievements was accompanied by growing awareness that even greater challenges and unprecedented opportunities lay ahead as the empire stood poised for expansion into regions that would test every aspect of the administrative innovation she and Albert had developed through years of patient cooperation. The Queen's daily correspondence revealed growing sophistication in understanding how economic development could serve imperial expansion more effectively than military coercion alone, as she supported initiatives that would create genuine prosperity for colonial populations while generating revenues that could fund continued territorial acquisition and infrastructure development. Her letters to governors emphasized policies that encouraged local industries, improved agricultural productivity, and developed natural resources in ways that benefited both imperial investors and indigenous communities seeking opportunities for advancement within British systems. Victoria's evening hours were devoted to maintaining the informal communication networks that supplemented official governmental channels throughout the empire. As her personal letters to administrators and their families created relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to effective governance, rather than simple bureaucratic authority. These connections provided valuable intelligence about local conditions, while encouraging honest reporting about both remarkable successes and occasional setbacks in colonial administration that required policy adjustments or additional resources. Her morning routine now encompassed coordination between governmental departments whose overlapping responsibilities required UNPR, unprecedented cooperation to manage territories spanning every continent and climate zone. She might simultaneously review War Office reports about frontier security while considering Colonial Office recommendations about immigration policies, then shift to Treasury briefings about revenue collection that affected resource allocation for infrastructure projects that would determine the character of imperial development for decades to come. The royal study had evolved into a comprehensive command center where information from every corner of the globe converged for analysis and decision that would affect the destinies of millions of subjects, whose welfare Victoria considered her personal responsibility despite never meeting the vast majority of populations under her authority. Filing systems organized with Germanic precision enabled immediate access to relevant documents when unexpected crises demanded rapid royal attention and authoritative resolution that balanced competing interests while maintaining overall imperial coherence. Prince Albert's analytical capabilities had created unprecedented understanding of how technological innovations were transforming both military strategy and civilian administration throughout the empire. As his systematic study of engineering reports revealed opportunities for improving transportation networks, communication systems, and manufacturing processes that would strengthen imperial capabilities while reducing operational costs. His morning analysis enabled identification of emerging technologies that could provide decisive advantages over potential rivals while improving living conditions for colonial subjects. Victoria's daily routine included regular consultations with naval commanders who coordinated fleet deployments that protected British commerce while projecting imperial power across strategic waterways from the English Channel to the South China Sea and beyond. She studied detailed charts showing patrol routes that ensured safe passage for merchant vessels while maintaining British presence in key locations, understanding how naval supremacy provided the essential foundation for every other aspect of imperial expansion and commercial development that characterized her remarkable reign. And so we reached the gentle close of our journey through the remarkable life of Queen Victoria and the empire that grew beneath her watchful guidance. From that quiet morning in 1819, when an infant princess drew her first breath, Kensington Palace, to the vast global dominion that would span every continent and ocean, we have witnessed one of history's most extraordinary transformations. Victoria's daily routines evolved from simple childhood lessons to the complex orchestration of governing territories where the sun never set, her morning correspondence expanding from palace letters to dispatches from every corner of the earth. Through 63 years of devoted service, she transformed not merely her own destiny, but the very fabric of civilization itself, leaving behind an empire whose influence would echo through generations yet to come. Rest well, knowing that, somewhere across those vast territories Victoria once governed, the gentle rhythms of daily life continue in communities she helped to shape, her legacy woven forever into the tapestry of our shared human story.